I'd like to very briefly tell you about Dr. Michael Widlanski. Michael is the author, as I told you, about the battle for our minds, the Western elites, and the terror threat, published in 2012 by a affiliate of Simon & Schuster. And I recommend it for anyone who wants to spend a few panicked, sleepless nights worrying about the threat of Islamic terrorism and the West's poor response. Dr. Widlanski received his PhD from Bar-Ilan University, a certificate with distinction in advanced Arabic at American University in Cairo, and a master's and bachelor's degree in international affairs and political science at Columbia University. Dr. Widlanski has had a varied career inside and outside of academia. He was a lecturer at the Rothberg School for Overseas Students at the Hebrew University from 1996 until he became a lecturer at Bar-Ilan University last year. He was the Arab Affairs correspondent for IDF Radio in Lebanon during the First Lebanon War. He worked at the New York Times Bureau, Jerusalem Bureau. He was a diplomatic correspondent for IBA Television and Middle East editor for the Jerusalem Post and Cox newspapers. Perhaps most impressively, in addition to English, Hebrew, and Arabic, several dialects, French and Russian, he speaks a mean Yiddish and recently completed a book project entitled A Look at Arabic Humor and Proverbs. Michael, b'vakasha.
Lecturing after Dr. Ahmed, it's a little bit like coming up with the ukulele after the Beatles. It's you know, there's a curse in Arabic I learned from the head of the Jewish community in Cairo. He heard me once curse somebody out, and the way Israelis curse, you know, the way they throw a few body parts around and usually refer to the ancestry, and he says, so uncouth. And he taught me a curse which I want to share with you, and it was, Inshallah yakun naharak zewishak. May you have a day like your face. And he said, now, if you say that to Dr. Ahmed, you're offering her a beautiful day. And I want to say, you also, before that, because I'm not interested in objectifying, you have a beautiful mind, and it's a little scary also. And now you met my wife, so you know that I like assertive, beautiful women, so there's no problem. But you scared me because it's been a long time since I read a book, and in the first 5 pages had to go to the dictionary 3 times, and English is my language. And your descriptions were very, 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 very telling. We've touched on a discussion here tonight which could go on for hours and hours and in many, many different directions. I'm a little scared talking now because I originally prepared for about a 10-minute address. And then Alan said, no, you can. And now afterwards I feel, I see a lot of friends here and a few colleagues, and I'm afraid afterwards they're going to say to me, may you have a day like your face. And so I beg your forgiveness a priori. I'm going to try and raise a few questions. Al-Islam huwa al-hal. The radical Islamists always say this. Islam is the answer. Islam is the solution. By this, they mean to say that Islam provides an answer for all needs. A cartoonist and a writer for The New Yorker, James Thurber, once said, "It is better to know some of the questions than all of the answers." And that is a particularly Jewish view. Naturally, Thurber was not a Muslim. He was Jewish. I don't think he was Orthodox. I have it on good authority that he was not Orthodox. But he was a chassid of humor. He was a devotee of humor, and a misnagid, an opponent of authority. Throughout history, one finds that Jews are overrepresented in revolutionary movements, and I suspect that this is due to the cultural and religious tendency of the Jews to ask questions all the time, especially asking questions of authority, especially absolute authority. You know that Samuel the prophet, Shmuel Hanavi, and several of the other early prophets show clearly that Judaism doesn't have a very high view or exalted view for authority, and a limiting view of the power of kings and autocrats. There is no divine right. Being a leader is conditional on proper behavior. That is why the American Constitution writers and their generation drew so much inspiration from the Hebrew Bible, even more than Christian scripture. The European monarchs had used Christian scripture as a justification for the divine right. And Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and the others did not like that. Now, you can say that it was basically that what had been done in Europe was basically a distortion of Christian scripture. Obviously, Jesus was humble. But nevertheless, that is what happened. And the American community, the American patriots, thought of themselves very much as the children of Israel. And Benjamin Franklin actually suggested as a flag for the United States the Ten Commandments or crossing the sea. As not very many people know that. And in fact, in the early 1800s and 1700s, the valedictory addresses were often made in Hebrew. This is not that widely known, but it's it has to do with the whole tradition that even the Jewish prophets questioned God. After all, when God is about to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Sodom v'Amorah, Abraham doesn't flinch from asking the question, and when you hear it in Hebrew in the synagogue, I, by avocation, some of you know I'm a Torah reader, Hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat. Will the master of the universe not make justice? You try asking a question like that to an American judge, or even in an Israeli court. You will find yourself in a cold prison cell so fast, it'll spin your head around. So imagine the chutzpah, imagine the chutzpah of Abraham turning to God and saying to him in his courtroom, so what about it, God? Are you going to keep your own standards? Ulai yesh. Maybe there are 50 pious men. Ulai yesh. 45 men. Maybe there are 40. Maybe, you know what, maybe there are 30. They say Jews are tough bargainers. But sometimes they bargain about the right things. And this kind of thing happens quite often in the Hebrew Bible. Moses, the most loyal and personal of God's prophets, doubts God's plan on a few occasions and wonders if it's going to work out. Maybe there are too many casualties. Maybe it's not going as fast as it ought to go. Elijah, Eliyahu Hanavi, Jonah, Yonah, Eov, Job, they all question what God is up to. And this isn't the only way we see the questioning of authority. Frequently, daughters and sons question and disagree with fathers and mothers, and wives even outmaneuver husbands. We know what Rivka was thinking, Rebecca was thinking, as far as what Isaac was planning with the two sons, Jacob and Esau, Yaakov and Esav. And the Bible even supports some of this questioning. It's very clear. One of my wife Sarah's favorite sayings is, Kol asher tomar elecha Sarah shma bekola. After all, and I quote this on many occasions, I better. And so the Jewish Bible commentators themselves ask tough questions about the conduct of the patriarchs, the conduct of the matriarchs. Was Sarah pushing too hard to have Hagar thrown out of the house, or vice versa? The prophets, the kings, David sinning with Bathsheba, I know, in the Hasidic community, I know all about that. They even say that Abraham made errors. He told, no, she's my sister, you know? There are all kinds of questions. You won't find that kind of thing in the Muslim community. And it's a serious problem. It's a serious, serious problem. Judaism elevates questioning and learning from error, and the whole idea of learning is one of the highest commandments. I think some of this is passed to Christianity. I think more of it in recent years. And nevertheless, you see a total distortion of what religion sometimes is viewed at in the world. A few years ago, CNN's reporter, CNN stands for certainly not news, Christiane Amanpour produced a documentary called God's Warriors. They called me up because they knew that I'd done some research on Jewish terrorism. And her series basically equated religious extremists of the three monotheistic faiths, lumping them all together with Islamic terrorists, Israeli settlers, all that kind of stuff. I think much of the series was based on sloppy and even slanted analysis. I don't know if Christiane Amanpour speaks any Arabic or any Hebrew. I doubt it. There are a lot of them like that. But it was a good example of shallow secularist thinking, making generalized condemnations of all religions as a political force. Religions can be a very good force if we understand that human beings all have a divine spark. This divine spark is the ultimate equalizer. It is the common ground. When we lose sight of that, and by the way, that's also true in Buddhism, other religions, this spark of life that comes from on high, that's important. You find it very difficult to talk about this, especially in the extreme Islamist community, but I think in Islamic communities in general. I don't want to take sides in the big debates between Robert Spencer and Bernard Lewis and all the others. I have my own personal views and I still have my own questions. And yet I also have questions about some of my colleagues in the Jewish community, some of the rabbis on various sides. I believe most of us have looked at the state of organized religion, and sometimes we see a recurring tendency on the part of some of the faithful, the part of the faithful that thinks it's holier than everybody else, to think that it has all the answers. I want to suggest that this is certainly not always so. I want to suggest further that it need not be so. And I want to suggest that normative Judaism and normative monotheism allows the option for asking questions. And I think that this is an option that exists in other religions too. The Jewish religion, certainly the Hebrew Bible, repeatedly stresses toleration for the stranger, for the other. Of all the commandments offered in the Hebrew Bible, v'yichiyagul itcha gel ba'artzechem lo tonu oto. If there be a stranger living among you, do not assault him, assail him, mistreat him. Of all the commandments, of the 613 commandments that are codified in the Jewish religion, this commandment is repeated more than any other commandment. I repeat, not to mistreat the other is repeated more than any other commandment in the Hebrew Bible. Isn't that amazing? And you shall love thy neighbor as thyself, etc. This is an underlying theme. So that theme, it might have to do with what you saw, Dr. Ahmed, and feel here in Israel. And it's important for that to be there. And I want to talk about the terminology. We use the term minority. The biggest minority, of course, is women. They're not really a minority anywhere, even in China, where they kind of cut the odds all the time by unnatural means. But women are treated like a minority, and even in Israel today, they are abused. They can be pushed to the back of the bus or pushed out of a taxi cab by men who claim to be men of God. These same men of God, supposedly men of God, sometimes protect the holiest site in Judaism, the Western Wall, the wall of the Temple Mount, by hurling profanities and worse than profanities at a holy site. We have a term for this in Yiddish. It's called shanda. It's called an abomination, a shame. It's horrible. Abuse of women in Israel also takes place in the secular community and even in the modern Orthodox community. For example, we've had a former president who assaulted women, a cabinet minister who forced himself on a secretary, and a prime minister's aide who looked under her dress and stalked her, etc. Fortunately, the situation in Israel has improved. These three high-level officials were either convicted or disciplined in various ways. By the way, the Israeli record is much better than the American record on this score. A lot better. A lot better. I mean, you can look at presidents and vice presidential candidates in the United States, and some of them were real doozies. And some of them are still walking around the world prancing and shaking their crooked fingers in and they did a lot of horrible things. In Israel, I'm not sure they would. Look, in the early days of the state, we had a fellow by the name of Moshe Dayan who did some horrible things. But today, we've improved. Thank God. We've had a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court who was a woman. We have a head of the Israeli Election Commission who's an Arab, Salim Jubran. We've had a prime minister who's a woman, and she wasn't assassinated. And she was a tough lady, and I liked her. And we should have more like her. Yet we can still do better to make sure that women get equal pay for equal work. Try to stop husbands and ex-boyfriends from beating and killing wives and ex-girlfriends. Still, there is no denying it's getting better. There is also no official policy tolerating discrimination or keeping minorities down. Thank God. You cannot walk in the streets and say, he doesn't deserve a job, he's an Arab. You'll get into trouble for that. I'm not going to give her a job, she's a woman. No, I'm not going to give him a job, he's a Christian. You'll get into trouble for that. Thank God. That's good. But the Middle East as a whole is not Israel. The Middle East, which basically runs from Morocco on the Atlantic to Iran and Iraq on the Gulf, and if we want to enlarge a little bit, we can include Pakistan and Afghanistan. The majority religion and the majority control in these areas are clearly Islamic societies, certainly the Arab countries. And they basically share an authoritarian perspective, sometimes even a totalitarian perspective, in their politics, and a relative lack of toleration of divergent religious and cultural views. One sees this in the Arab states, in Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan. Christians are regularly attacked. I'm going to skip this part. And the forces that pushed a lot of this craziness are the Wahhabi movement in Saudi Arabia, which is connected, by the way, with, I think, some of the movements in Pakistan by their teaching and the export of these doctrines. I'm not going to go into it. It's not my area of expertise. But the perversion of the Hanbali school of Islam in various respects in Pakistan, Madbuli's doctrine, all of these things flowed out of the Wahhabi culture. And in fact, when you look at Saudi Arabia, I've once told my friends, I think it's the only country in the world that's named after a family. It would be like Israel being called Goldberg or Vaknin. It's just the Saudi Arabia. I want to offer a generalization. When there is a strong secularist or modernist counterbalance to Islamism, as there used to be in the pre-Ayatollah Iran or the pre-Erdogan Turkey, then divergent viewpoints and minority rights are tolerated, if not safeguarded. As public levels of Islamic religiosity rise, minority rights tend to subside. So let's ask a question, and let's borrow a phrase of Bernard Lewis, a book of his. What's wrong with Islam? What happened? As Professor Lewis himself might say, it is too easy to say that Islam ipso facto leads to authoritarianism, to persecution of women, Jews, Christians, Baha'is, homosexuals, etc. After all, several Islamic empires included relatively high levels of toleration, relatively high, not all the time, not in all places, but relatively high. If you compare what was going on in medieval Europe with what was going on in medieval Islam, relatively high levels of toleration for women, Jews, and yes, even homosexuals. A poet known as Abu Nuwas, an unrepentant, flaming homosexual, was one of the court favorites during the early caliphate. Indeed, Abu Nuwas, I studied this with my professor at Columbia, Pierre Kakia. We had a joke about Abu Nuwas, who used to play jokes on other people, and he wrote something in graffiti against the Sultan, and as they were leading him off to behead him, he passed by the graffiti and erased one of the dots on one of the things they wrote, and it turned it from the Sultan is a grasshopper into the Sultan is the greatest of man, something like that. Just a little, and he was always playing these little tricks. He also wrote poems about drinking and even homosexuality itself, and yet he was considered a great man during the caliphate. And as the Jews tend to say, lahavdil, lahavdil. You also have great Jewish scholars who were considered top court officials in Islam, such as Maimonides, the Rambam, and others who were very important officials. Yet today, not 1400, not 1500, not 700 or 750, today, 2000, you look at the Arab Islamic community, boy, what's happened? So what happened? What's wrong with Islam? And let me give you two leading questions. I don't know if I can give you the answers. Is this a psychological problem tied to the fact that Islam has seemed to decline? Is it because it has been seen to be a failure by its own believers? By its own believers, lagging behind the West in recent centuries, that they've gone a little bit nuts. Is the rising intolerance connected to this because Islamic failure needs scapegoats? And who are better scapegoats than minorities? Or, perhaps an alternative, is this the result of a built-in cultural or political flaw in Islamism, or what is sometimes called, I don't like the term, but fundamentalist Islam? But I can sharpen the question a little bit. Is it fundamentalist Islam, or is it fundamentally Islam? Is it perhaps a religion that wants to provide all the answers, was built by a general, but has trouble asking the right questions? Remember, Muhammad himself was not such a tolerant guy. There was a woman poet in his time who asked a few tough questions. He decreed that she be tied to two camels and she was taken in two different directions and ripped apart. That's not very tolerant. So there are bases. Now I'll move from the questions to prospective solutions. I don't have solutions. I want to say right up front, I don't have solutions. You're laughing, we know. But let me say that there are basically four avenues for solutions, and they come in one-word titles. There is first, charm. 2, guilt. 3, shame. And 4, force. If I want to be kind of wishy-washy and politically correct, I can say education, but let's. Anyone here who was a student of my wife is going to love this, okay. Anyone here who was a student of the Obama administration knows that Barack Obama comes from the charm school. President Barack Obama has spent a little over 4 years trying to charm North Korea, Vladimir Putin, Iran, much the way he charms American voters. He tries to charm anybody, and this is especially true of the Arab Islamic world. This has about as much chance of success as singing country western music to an angry rattlesnake. Yes, I know that some of you will say there are people who can charm snakes. But I want to tell you that real smart snake charmers, and I know this from personal experience, real smart, I've seen this in Thailand, real smart snake charmers defang the cobras before they use them. Besides, snakes are deaf. They can feel vibrations. Cobras sometimes follow the movements of the flute. But I would not bet my life on it. As for the second avenue, the use of guilt, this is an approach that works best on policymakers who are still nursing on their mother's chicken soup or frequently attend confessionals at the local parish church. My late and great friend Adir Zik used to talk about Jews who do this. He called it schnitzel Judaism, which is because they would bang their breast like you do chickens when you have chicken breasts. He called this, he said, beating your breast doesn't work. Not too many Middle East leaders, heads of states, or chiefs of terror groups who destroy minority rights are interested in the guilt approach. Nevertheless, the method of using guilt is no stranger to Western strategy and diplomacy. It is amazing, just amazing, how many times you hear presidents, prime ministers, secretaries general trying to sell us on the guilt trip. But Middle East autocrats are not buying tickets. President Jimmy Carter, I've met him a couple times. President Jimmy Carter, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, but little else, that's the only thing he ever won, once tried to get Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev to make peace by saying, I swear this is true, I'm not making this up. God will not forgive us if we do not succeed. It is reliably reported that Brezhnev could not stop laughing. Appealing to guilt or God when dealing with an atheist autocrat like Brezhnev or Kim of Korea, you should excuse me if I say it's ill, is not likely to produce results. It is also not likely to produce results when dealing with an Iranian regime that thinks that your God is their devil. Okay? So let's move to the third category, shame. Surprisingly, shame can sometimes get results. Even the Nazis and the Soviets occasionally released people from jail or camps when they were embarrassed publicly by film or documentary evidence that made them look bad. You remember the Nazis once used to do films of Theresienstadt? They wanted to, why? Because they were a little embarrassed. I myself was involved with something like this in our negotiations with Syria in 1991 and 92. You didn't talk about this, but it's all right. My friend Yossi Ben Aharon asked me to be what he called the hitman for the Israeli delegations. He didn't want me to go over and beat up on the Syrians. He wanted me to dig up the dirt and make them look bad. And he said, I want you to go after terrorism, anti-Semitism, drug running, abuse of Jews, what they're doing in Lebanon. I said, Yossi, stop. I'm going to use drugs. And he said, why? I said, because it's going to work. And we produced in 1991 and 92 material that showed that the Syrians were responsible for 20% of the heroin coming into the United States, and a lot of the I'm not familiar with all these drugs. What's that? Cocaine. I get no kick from cocaine. Right. Cocaine. And 3 hearings were started in Congress. And all of a sudden, the Syrians said, wait. They were being very embarrassed. The first Bush administration had all kinds of things that it was thinking about doing with the Syrians. And the Syrians all of a sudden started letting Jews out of Syria. Nobody knows about this. 2,000 Jews were let out in 6 months. One of the funny things about this, Yossi Beilin tried to take credit for it years later. Never mind, I don't want to get started on him. The important thing is that shaming the Syrians got a good result for a minority community, and that sometimes it can work. For short bits of time, certain particular circumstances, but generally only for a short amount of time. Today, people say that using the press to embarrass or weaken a regime is the use of soft power. Okay, if you want to call it soft power, that's fine. This brings me to the final category, the force or the use of force or real power. This is what all political scientists really love. This is my stuff. Power is the language we all understand, but it is probably the only language that tyrants and terrorists understand. And the first thing to remember is that when our parents told us, now Michael, force never solves anything. Alan, force never solves anything. They were lying. When you say to somebody, if you do this, then I will bloody your nose, boycott your products, destroy your electric grid, or blow up your city, we are talking about the threat or the use of force. In the political science community, this is called deterrence. Deterrence is, if you do this or continue to do this, then I will do this and that. Deterrence is getting the other guy not to do something. If a US president says to North Korea, if you launch a missile, you will vex me, you will make me angry, this is not really a deterrent. Or if a US president says to Iran, if you build a bomb, then I will get really, really mad. That is not really a deterrent. Or if a US president says to Syria, if you use chemical weapons, then that is crossing a red line. And then he says he did not really mean red, but somewhere between orange, yellow, amber, green. After all, I'm colorblind. Then that is not a deterrent. Deterrence has a chance of working if the threat is strong enough, and if the foe is rational, and if he believes you will carry out your threat. In the strategic community, we call this a credible deterrent, a believable deterrent. Allow me a cute story that involves Mae West. Mae West, Saddam Hussein, and Obama. Mae West used to say, you know, she had a come on line to guy. Well, that was the first line. Then she said, Toby, what? Is that a banana in your pocket, or are you happy to see me? Now, if you're going in to see Saddam Hussein, or Saddam Hussein is coming in to see you, you want to know if he's packing. This has a real story behind it. In 1988, I was at an Arab summit conference in Amman, Jordan. And Saddam Hussein came into a meeting with Hafiz Assad. And Saddam came in wearing his 2 pearl-handled revolvers. He was packing. And Hosni Mubarak was there. And this is 30 years ago. Hosni Mubarak was a strong guy. And he was ready, because we didn't know it was going to happen. Nobody knew it was going to happen. Saddam reached in for one of the things and put it on the table. Everybody thought he might reach in and shoot Hafiz Assad, his fellow Ba'athist. So he was packing, and people took him seriously. The problem is, when you're Obama and you talk to the Ayatollahs, or you talk to the Pakistani government, you say, be nice to your Christians. And they say, is that a pistol in your pocket, or are you carrying that banana again? And that's the problem. It's also a problem if you're not a rational actor, or you don't act by the same rationale that Westerners seem to act. If you're a crazy Shiite Ayatollah who believes the 13th Imam will reappear and save the world only after half the world is burned down, then threatening a hot time in Iran is not really a deterrent, because the Iranian concept of rational is a little different from even the Chicago concept of rational. Going beyond deterrence is coercion. Coercion is a political science term for when you say to somebody, unless you do A, I will do B. Deterrence tries to prevent. Coercion tries to change or cure. Coercion is when you say to the North Korean regime, either you get rid of your missiles and your gas chambers, and you know, of course, that North Korea uses gas chambers, and has killed hundreds of people in gas chambers. Or else, it is when you say to Iran, destroy your atomic reactors, or we will destroy your military capacity and the Iranian Guard. We will. However, even deterrence and coercion have different levels. One of the most favorite forms of deterrence and coercion is economic sanctions. It usually does not involve loss of life, or at least a visible loss of life. That's why Western politicians love it. That's also why it usually doesn't work. That is why Eastern regimes ignore it, okay? Sometimes sanctions can work, help bring down South Africa. The Americans used a form of economic sanctions and carrots to get Jews out of the Soviet Union. That seemed to work a little bit, but it probably wouldn't work today. Richard Pearl, who was an aide to Henry Jackson, who put forth the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which was all about using sanctions against the Soviets, says that it probably wouldn't work in today's world. So anyway, these are a couple of the variations. I'll just get 2 minutes? 2 minutes. If you think of military, you should be scared. Israel went into Lebanon in 1982, and I know it very well because I was there. Partly because, or at least it was justified, because Menachem Begin thought that he would be helping Christian communities in Lebanon. I thought about that very much when the US went into Iraq. On one level, you certainly want to get rid of a Saddam Hussein, you want to stop the abuse of minorities, you want to do that. But you have to also question whether you have the ability to effect change without really getting badly hurt yourself. The same thing today in Syria. I personally feel that the Syrian regime is so bad that you should do something about it, even if you have a short-term rise of Al-Qaeda or some of the other groups. That's personally my view, but I've been to Syria and I've seen some of the horrible things they've done, but there are no easy answers. Still, if we start out with the right questions, we might be on the right path. Thank you.